clap. And it's all yours, Terri. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, everybody online. All right, my book this year is called The Socrates Express. The full title, The Socrates Express in Search of Life Lessons for Dead Philosophers. And for those of you who are online, there's the handout, the link to the handout is just one page, and it's simply a list of the chapter titles and the years, the birth and death years of the different philosophers, and then a little reference to the train journeys. So it's not something you need to follow, it's just maybe a reference, because all this stuff about philosophy for me gets pretty complicated, and I'm not familiar with many of these people, so it's a way to kind of track where we are. So about Eric Weiner, I guess is the way to pronounce his name. He on his website, he describes himself as an author, a speaker, and he is a former NPR correspondent. He joined NPR in 1992 and spent a couple of years in the Washington Bureau and then on their foreign desk, where he was assigned all around the world. He has reported from over 30 countries. He lived in India for a period of time. And prior to that, he also spent some time as a business reporter with the New York Times. He says, "I prefer to think of myself as a philosophical traveler who is obsessed with the intersection of places and ideas. He is married with one daughter, adopted from Kazakhstan, and lives near Washington, D.C. Other books that he has written, his first was called The Geography of Bliss, One Grump's Search for the Happiest Places in the World. Man Seeks, that was 2008. 2011, he published Man Seeks God, My Flirtations with the Divine, and 2016, The Geography of Genius. So this, and he's written lots and lots of articles and just pages and pages of those. But this is his fourth book, published in 2020. Let me just make a quick check. Can you give Beverly a signal if you can hear me okay online?
No, we're good.
Good. All right. So comments that he makes about this book on his website. He describes it as a pilgrimage that uncovers surprising life lessons from around the world. And he fronts each chapter with a little story about a train journey. So that's the journeys that you see on the right side of the handout. He uses a little introductory story to describe being on this train journey. And he does this because he finds he loves to travel by train, and he says it's the most thoughtful mode of transportation. His website blurb about the book calls it a rollicking intellectual journey, following in the footsteps of history's greatest thinkers and showing us how each offers practical and spiritual lessons for today's unsettled times. The NPR review about the book says this isn't an explanation about philosophy, it's an invitation to think and experience philosophy, filtered through the author's words. They say that the reviewer says he frames each philosopher's words in the context of the one thing that can help us do better. So you see that what he picks up as one thing about each philosopher in the chapter title. The book is engaging with plenty of humor and straightforward prose. The book was awarded the Townsend University Literature Prize in 2022. That's a university in Maryland where he lives. They describe it as an engaging memoir, informative, thoughtful, and down to earth. a pleasure to read. My blurb, it's part travelogue, part memoir, very conversational and thought-provoking. A nice simpler plate. I kind of saw it as like going to a city and taking a hop-on, hop-off bus, where you just get a little orientation to these different places. You don't necessarily go deep into any one, but of course you could go further if you want to. I found it interesting to think about, with some of his comments about the philosophers, to think about biblical stories that maybe relate or reinforce some of the philosophical themes that he talks about. The book is structured with an introduction, 14 chapters covering 14 different philosophers that, and it's broken, it's not chronological, but it's broken into 3 parts, which are really talking, he has broken these philosophers into kind of stages of life: dawn, noon, and dusk. So those are the 3 parts. And then there's a short epilogue. And as I said, there's a little train story at the beginning of every chapter. It's in a different font, so it's kind of set off as an introduction. And most of those train journeys were going to one of the locations where he's visiting a place where this philosopher lived, although that's not always the case. He cross-references a lot between the different philosophers and references to other philosophers also. There's a little bit about the different schools of philosophy, Stoicism and empiricism, but not a lot, not something to get stuck in. But he uses a lot of interviews. He goes and talks to professors or people that live in the area, and provides reflections on how the philosophy applies to daily life. And that's maybe the most interesting part of the book, and also where it becomes part memoir, because he talks about how this particular philosophy applies to him, uses a number of stories about his interactions with his teenage daughter as illustrations of particular concepts, and some of her reactions to the philosophical concepts. He also brings in, things that happen day to day, some of the frustrations of travel, not being able to get a train ticket or something in India, and how the philosopher would have approached that problem. So let's jump in to the introduction, which he titles Departure. So he talks a little bit about knowledge versus wisdom, knowledge being something you possess versus wisdom, something you do, and says that the word philosopher in the Greek means lover of wisdom. He says that he uses the train story motif because he finds that there's something amniotic about being inside of a train, and that he thinks that pairs well with philosophy, a lot of time for reflection and thinking. He says philosophy is therapeutic, but not the way a hot stone massage is therapeutic. Philosophy is not easy. It is not nice. It is not palliative. Less spa than gym. So it's a workout. Philosophy is not a body of knowledge, but a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that opens our eyes to possibility. And he says we need different kinds of wisdom at different stages of our life. And that's, I think why he structured the book into those 3 parts. So the first chapter, dawn, the first part about dawn, how to get out of bed like Marcus Aurelius. And he talks about the question of whether or not to get out of bed every day, he calls it the great bed question, being a real philosophical undertaking every day. Do I get out of this bed or do I stay in the bed? So Marcus Aurelius was not a morning person. He stayed in bed, and he references something that Marcus Aurelius wrote called the Meditations. He says the meditation is an exhortation, a lot of little reminders and pep talks. He says it's like Roman fridge notes that you put on your refrigerator. Aurelius was a wisdom scavenger who he says gives us advice not only on how to get out of bed, but why bother. He's a Stoic who often exhorts himself to stop thinking and act. And one, I'll give you for each philosopher, there are worlds of quotes from all of these folks, but I'll give you one quote that I found from each philosopher just to kind of hold in your mind. So the Aurelius quote is, accept the things to which fate binds you and love the people with whom fate brings you together, but do so with all your heart. That's your little dose of Aurelius for today. So then we move on to Socrates, how to wonder like Socrates. So unsurprisingly, Socrates is the king of the question. And he says his particular wisdom was in knowing what he didn't know. He talks about Socrates experiencing questions, living with questions, residing in the question, and working through conversations and dialogue. And of course, we're familiar with the concept of Socratic dialogue, using conversations and dialogue to just pick things apart and unwind what the world is telling us. He says he's remembered not for what he knew, but how he went about knowing it, these conversational approaches, and his patience in just living with questions and taking time to talk them through. And he is credited as the founder of Western philosophy. So the Socrates quote, which I'm sure we've all heard, the unexamined life is not worth living. So we then move on to Rousseau in the 1700s in France. So he says, and we know from our John Bowles classes that Rousseau was one of the foundational thinkers who contributed to some of the founding fathers of this country and their thinking. So he says the core philosophy that Rousseau had was nature good, society bad. But he talks about walking, Richard, like you walking over here. He says, my body must be in motion to make my mind active. Rousseau was a romanticist, a philosopher of the heart, who elevated passions and made feelings acceptable. That was something kind of new that Rousseau introduced at that stage of history. The Rousseau quote, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. So then we move on, just the next century, how to see like Thoreau. So he says Thoreau, like Aurelius, was a wisdom scavenger. He studied the Western philosophies as well as Indian and Chinese sources. Thoreau had a faith in the things that are seen. He was less interested in the nature of reality than the reality of nature. So I'll go through that again. Less interested in the nature of reality than the reality of nature. He says he was a transcendentalist. He found that seeing and feeling were intertwined, and said it was important to slow down to cultivate an innocence of the eye. He said Thoreau was known, on his wanderings to just stop. He could spend a whole day just watching some ants crawl around and imagining what was going on with the ants, and just spend the whole day just watching these ants. So the Thoreau quote that I picked out is, rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. Now we move on to Arthur Schopenhauer, how to listen like Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer was an idealist. He believed that the world exists as a mental construct only when we perceive it. So it's our perceptions that create the world around us, and that the world is not a rational place. He is known as the philosopher of pessimism. We are the author of our own cruelty, fated to consume ourselves. He believed that there were two escapes from this kind of pessimistic view. One was to lead an ascetic life and to fast and just kind of go off by yourself. The second was liberation through art, music, story, visual art. There was a story that he gives that really entertained me. Schopenhauer enlists a porcupine to explain human relations. Imagine a group of porcupines huddled on a cold winter's day. They stand close to one another, absorbing their neighbor's body heat, lest they freeze to death. Should they stand too close, though, they're pricked by a needle. Tossed between two evils, says Schopenhauer, the animals approach and retreat again and again until they discover the proper distance from which they could best tolerate one another. He calls this the porcupine's dilemma. We need others to survive, but others can hurt us. Relationships demand constant course corrections, and even the most skilled navigators get pricked now and then. I thought that was a great little anecdote. The Schopenhauer quote, "Mostly it is loss which teaches us about the worth of things." All right, moving on to how to enjoy like Epicurus. Epicurus was an empiricist who believed that we know the world through our senses. He distinguished the world as being broken into pleasure and pain, with pleasure being the beginning and the end of the happy life, the highest good, and the absence of pain. He, kind of contrary to what we sometimes think about overindulgence when we think about Epicurus, but he says, no, he was really all about the simple life. He had this little garden and people came and they talked and they spent time in his garden. His focus was on what is good enough, with having a deep gratitude for what happens at you, not to you, at you. And he describes spending time with somebody that was an expert in Epicurean philosophy, and he would talk about things happening at him. I found this phone happened at me. Kind of a funny little concept. The quote from Epicurus is, "Nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little." All right, how to pay attention like Simone De Bruyne. So this is our first female philosopher that he introduces. She was a mystic and a political activist who was born in France but lived her later years in England. She says one forgets oneself, one forgets everything. Her focus was on suspended thinking, extreme attention as a state of being. So I kind of thought about this in the context of what we now talk about with mindfulness. But she was particularly focused, her big theme was attention. Attention is love, love is attention. Acknowledging and honoring the other. So this really brought to mind for me some of our training in Community of Hope about listening and really focusing on the other. And the quote, which I really love from her, is, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." How to fight like Gandhi. So he describes Mahatma Gandhi as being obsessed with masculinity, but a masculinity that derives its strength not from violence, but from its opposite. Gandhi was, he said, spiritually omnivorous, and he studied a lot of different philosophers and religions, but he found that the Hindu Bhagavad Gita was what most satisfied his needs. And the particular essence of that spoke to him was that the true battlefield lies within ourselves. He said that Gandhi was process-oriented rather than goal-oriented. He aimed for an India that was worthy of independence and believed in nonviolence as an inviolable principle. The quote from Gandhi is, "The future depends on what we do in the present." Confucius, how to be kind like Confucius. So with Confucius, he describes something called the practice of Ren. And he said there's really not a good English translation for this concept of Ren. He said the closest he could get is what he would say is wholeheartedness. But Ren includes 5 cardinal virtues: respect, magnanimity, sincerity, earnestness, and kindness. And he said Confucius talked about the importance of ritual as a container for kindness, a way of holding kindness through ritual. The most important thing for Confucius was filial piety, but he said it was an unswerving but not unthinking devotion to parents. And he saw the family as our Ren gym. So the family being the container within which to practice these cardinal virtues, and particularly kindness. He believed that all of us have an inherent kindness, but that it must be mobilized through study and moral self-cultivation. The quote from Confucius that spoke to me was, "What the superior man seeks is in himself. What the small man seeks is in others." So I think that relates to that moral self-cultivation. So the next is how to appreciate the small things, like Sai Shonagan. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly. This is another woman, and not someone who is known. You won't find her name in any list of the great philosophers. He said she didn't have a system or theories, but the one thing she's known about is something called the Pillow Book, which was a private diary. 297 numbered entries that in literary terms followed a Japanese practice known as suhitsu, or following the brush and allowing the structure to emerge. So there's no narrative thread. She simply is describing her world through these numbered entries. He said that he would classify her in philosophical terms as being a student of perspectivism. There is not one truth, but many, but choose one and make it your own. He said a core part of her belief was that who we are is largely shaped by what we choose to surround ourselves with. And he talks about her as being flexibly opinionated. So just to give you an example of the kinds of things that are in her pillow book diary. For every one thing Shunnigan likes, there are 3 she finds unpleasant or disturbing or repulsive, or her ultimate smackdown, infuriating. Among these, she says, a guest who arrives when you have something urgent to do. A very ordinary person who beams insanely as she prattles on and on. A dog that discovers a clandestine lover as he comes creeping in and barks. Please. Someone who butts in when you're talking and smugly provides the ending herself. Indeed, anyone who butts in, be they child or adult, is most infuriating. Flies. A mosquito that announces itself with that thin little wail just as you've settled sleepily into bed. Rain all day on New Year's Eve. They're just delightful little things. So yeah, it kind of makes me want to read the pillow book. But the quote I picked up from her was, in life, there are 2 things which are dependable: the pleasures of the flesh and the pleasures of literature. She was a newbie. All right, a more familiar name, How to Have No Regrets, like Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche, the bad boy of Western philosophy. So one of Nietzsche's core concepts was what he called the eternal recurrence of the same. So the author says his favorite movie is Groundhog Day. And that Nietzsche's concept was like Groundhog Day, but every repetition is the same. And he believed that that's what we were all fated to experience, is the exact same life again and again and again. No changes. You can't do anything differently. You can't time travel back and forth, but again and again and again, we're going to live this life with its good and with its bad. And he says the universe just repeats itself. And he says that that we ought to view this as an existential stress test. Are you living the life you want to live? Because you're going to keep doing it again and again and again. So if something's not right, better figure it out, because it's going to happen again and again and again. So he talked about having control of our attitudes, not our actions, choosing to find joy in uncertainty and suffering. There's a little bit about, which kind of, I don't know a lot about Nietzsche, but this kind of surprised me. The spirit of every good philosopher, Nietzsche said, is that of a dancer, not necessarily a good dancer. Better to dance ponderously than to walk lamely, he said, and he did. He couldn't even muster a few decent steps on the dance floor. So be it. The good philosopher, like the good dancer, is willing to make a fool of himself. So he says he's not trying to prove anything. He simply wants you to see the world and yourself differently. When life is good, dance. When it hurts, dance. The quote from Nietzsche, to live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. So next we have Epictetus, early Greek philosopher, a Stoic. He describes, so we've moved now with Nietzsche, I haven't forgotten about the parts, we've moved with Nietzsche into the dusk, the last phase of life, so the dusk setting. He describes Stoicism and Epictetus as an older person's philosophy. Change what you can and accept what you can't. He said, what upsets people is not things themselves, but their judgments about things. We can change the way we feel by changing the way we think. So he talks about noticing and relabeling our immediate impressions and emotions. So the feeling that we get when something happens to us is an immediate feeling, but we can stop and we can step back from that and relabel it, find a different way of looking at it. So examples would be, if you're alone, relabel your solitude as tranquility. If you're stuck in a crowd, relabel it as a festival. Accept all contentedly. The quote from Epictetus, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. How to grow old like Beauvoir. So here we have Simone De Bruyne from France, a more modern, maybe the most modern of the philosophers that he talks about. Says she was an existentialist. Man's nature is to have no nature. We are what we do. Her writings on old age make for grim reading. She aged reluctantly and combatively before making peace with old age. Old age should rouse passion, not passivity. She talks about the poetry of habit and wrote that in their rhythm, my days resemble one another, yet my life does not seem stagnant to me. So she talks about, I spend a lot of time reading and listening to music, but I read different things and I listen to different music. And so it's not stagnant, it's always changing. The pattern is the same and the habit is comfortable, but it's not stagnant. Her quote, one's life has value so long as one attributes value to the life of others. And lastly, how to die like Montaigne. Michel de Montaigne was a skeptic. He built his tower of certainty one doubt at a time, looking at every idea from various perspectives, believed that humans can never know an absolute truth. The author says he sees himself in Montaigne, restless in mind and body. He enjoys traveling, but coming home more. Sees Montaigne as his philosophical soulmate. Montaigne was obsessed about dying. It is not death, but dying that alarms me. A Montaigne quote was, we must always be booted and ready to go. That is the end, but not the goal of life. Belief doesn't worry about how to fall. And he believed it was important to come to a place where we could have a full and generous acceptance of death as being something that happens to all of us. The Montaigne quote I picked out was, the greatest thing in the world is to know how to belong to oneself. So after going through all of these stories and train journeys and interviews and references and all of this, the epilogue I really enjoyed. It's very short. So in the epilogue, he talks about being on the kind of a final trip home, being on the train from Washington, D.C. to Silver Spring, Maryland. He says, I get off the train. I'm not strolling like Rousseau. I'm not sauntering like Thoreau. Mine is the hurried gait of the commuter. So he gets up to a stoplight and he's fumbling around with something on his phone, and he drops his phone. And he picks it up and the glass is just shattered. The phone is broken and he's mad and angry. He said, wait a minute, I'm just writing this book on philosophy. let me take a mini pause and try to process this, navigate this little mini crisis. So I just thought this was a wonderful example of how some of these little nuggets can, you know, maybe be something useful in our day-to-day life. So he said, what would Socrates do? Stop, question my assumptions, ask some questions, think about this, take a pause. The great pause, not a mini pause. Epicurus, he said, would look at this and say, that phone was neither a natural nor necessary pleasure. Good riddance. Cy Shonigan would say the phone, like the cherry blossom, is unimportant. Celebrate that. The Stoics would have no pity for this little mini crisis. What's important is that I can control my reaction. I can sulk or not. I can be angry or not. It's my choice. My choice. And Nietzsche says, you will walk this street and drop this phone and fret again and again and again for all eternity. Can you live with that? Can you love that? So that's where I thought it was marvelous. It was a fun book to read and easy to read. You know, I just took it kind of one chapter a day, and lots of places it made me smile. Very human, very human. And for me, you know, a nice little dip into key concepts from these different philosophers without getting stuck in the different schools and concepts and theories and how they develop. So, any questions?
A wonderful summary, and I'm definitely going to read it. I just started it. But one thing I thought about is I started digging into women philosophers and how long they've existed. And apparently they've always been there for thousands of years. It's just that nobody reads their works. And so according to Wikipedia, women have been totally unwelcome in philosophy departments.
Right.
And so it's just very recently that they're trying to start welcoming women. So I wish he would have tried a little harder. But I understand he wants to sell a book too.
Yeah.
And if it's lists 5 people you've never heard of, you probably wouldn't get it published. So I understand that. So that's one thought I had. Another thought I had was this is very much like the works of Bill Bryson.
Yeah.
And which is delightful. You just don't think about a travel series, and particularly if you put philosophy into a travel series. That's very creative.
It is. It's a very creative approach. It makes me want to read. I particularly want to go back and read his Grump book, the first one about happiness and searching for happiness in different parts of the world and what happiness means in different parts of the world.
I got it on Audible, and I guess I got through about half of it because it just started. I highly recommend it on Audible because he reads it himself.
Oh, he does.
Yeah, and it's really, you just can't help laughing because you know he's really very humorous, but it's the timing. It's like a good comedian.
Yeah.
The timing of it. You know,
I can imagine that with all of his stories about his daughter and being on the train to Paris and her teenage reaction.
I was somehow, you know, the title, you're saying, oh, I'm and you're ready for this. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's really, as you say, it's a delightful read. But I recommend it on Audible.
Oh, good. I'll have to try that.
I started as well. I got through that whole chapter, but in the introduction, one of the things he says, I think, is that life turns everyone into a philosopher.
Yes.
And I thought that was quite appropriate.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is first chapter, which struck me too, is the difference between duty and obligation. An obligation is what you owe others, and you will, in effect, if you don't, duty is what you owe yourself.
Right.
And I thought that was an interesting way to kind of think of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's so
I
much,
thought about
that's-
that relative to Queen Elizabeth.
Oh,
the
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
The current.
maybe versus up.
Absolutely, yeah. That's been her hallmark of her life, that was her dad's approach, and it's just, yeah. And her mom's, I mean, it's really interesting. Whether they can preserve that is the question. It's interesting, but I think of that whole thing of following her duty to do, you know, what she knows she can do.
well, that's a good example. There's a whole lot in this book that I haven't covered, obviously, not as with any book, but there's just lots of little nuggets, but it's all woven together through this,
Yeah.
you know, this kind of narrative story that's just very easy to follow. And so,
And it's impressive because you get an idea of where he's gone in his travels. I mean,
yeah,
and working for NPR over the years and stuff,
Yeah.
it's just, it's impressive that people go out and are willing to live in, you know, not
Yeah.
necessarily ideal conditions.
Beverly Palmer.
I read a couple of his previous books several years ago and really, really enjoyed them, especially the Geography of Bliss. But and I'm looking forward to reading this one too. I found him, this author, through another author, actually, A.J. Jacobs. I don't know if you've all read him. He wrote A Year of Biblically Living, and where he takes all of these concepts of the fundamentalist Orthodox Jewish laws and lives each one religiously for a week, for a month, and what he learns from this, and then he also wrote the Guinea Pig Diaries, where he explores different fads and things like this, and Drop Dead Healthy, where he explores for a month each dietary fad, you know, and but it's much the same sort of type of author, and he's very funny too. But I really recommend you all checking into A.J. Jacobs as well. Yeah, thank you for this, because I'm really looking forward to reading this.
What makes me want to read it, I mean, of course, maybe the audio, is I've ridden that train out to Silver Springs many times, but the best part of that ride is from Silver Springs on up to Martinsburg. It just goes along the Potomac and the old canal, whatever it was, and the canal, and it crosses the Potomac out of Harper's Ferry. They have a beautiful train running through those parts of Maryland.
Yeah.
So, look for another book to come, I would say. Yeah, good. Like I did, the next time I'm on that train, I'll listen to it.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Sounds like it's elevated it so much more beyond travel literature. I mean, I remember wading through Paul Thoreau once as an assigned topic, and it was heavy slogging.
Yeah.
And he was also so in love with himself as a writer. It was really hard to get past the conceit onto what is the subject here. So
Yeah.
what a good job.
He talks a little bit, you know, and he goes into greater and lesser detail on different philosophers, but he'll talk about them. He says they're people, you know, they're people. They had good moods and bad moods. They weren't, you know, these sort of demigods. They were real people just trying to figure things out. So,
The other thing I found interesting is that, you know, he complains about how philosophy is taught. He said philosophy is taught as kind of history these days,
Yeah.
you know, about, you know, like, okay, what did Socrates say about this? What did, you know,
right.
you know, and he said, he kind of gets you to think about philosophy as a how-to process,
Right.
but it's not about what happened or what did this person say or why did they say it. It's how do you live, The real question and title of each one of these is how to do something.
Yes,
So
like
it's,
this
it's, it's basically, so, philosophy is really in its essence about how
very
to books,
practical. Yeah,
which are,
yeah, and that's what I loved about that story in the epilogue, dropping this phone, because we can all relate to that. Oh, and then let's take a little mini pause and think about this.
They used to
Again
have this
and
thing
again and
about
again.
stepping up to philosophy, like when Emerson was young, they had to step up to Kant, because Kant was up here on the pedestal, like German philosophy, so you'd have to study, like American philosophers like Rousseau to get you ready
To get you
step
ready.
up to Kant. So that's sort of what this book reminds me of. I mean,
Yeah.
it help you get ready to
Yeah,
understand something or kind of ramp you up a little bit.
yeah,
One comment I really liked, I mean, one thing he said was that we're really good at solving problems in America, but we don't experience questions much.
yes,
We're not good
Yeah.
at experiencing questions. That's amazing. That kind of reminds me of the Stephen Ministry program. I went to training for that.
Mhm.
And that Americans are fantastic at solving problems, at listening and asking questions, not so much.
right, right. Yeah, and I really, that, of all the philosophers he went through, the one that really spoke to me was that, who was it? It was Simone Weil, and the attention, the generosity of real attention, and how hard that is. Attention is love, love is attention. So, that's all I got.
Anyone?
Oh, I know, one other thing for the Audible folks. We're gonna have to be Audible. I'm gonna look this up so I can get the author's name, because I mentioned it before.
Don't
So-
drop it. Don't drop that phone. Just saying.
She's got a million
So-
hours of protection on there.
I
She's
do.
already worried about it.
So I am currently listening to an Audible, The Great Passion by James Runcie, which is a novel, but it's about Bach. And it's about a student who gets sent to the school and becomes a soprano, and it's about Bach's family. And I think it leads into his writing of The Great Passion, but it's wonderfully narrated. And it's all about singing in the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. So that would be something that would really appeal to this group, The Great Passion. So, and I'm enjoying it on Audible too. I like the narration. I thought it was going to have music in it, but it talks a lot about music and about the organs. Anyway, it's a good one.
Thank you so
So,
much.
thank you, Terry. Anyone else, other home questions or thoughts, or just appreciate everyone doing
next week.
Next week is Logan Farron. Sports related. He always weaves in sports somehow. Sports is like, yeah, so Logan Farron next week. So yes, thank you, Terry. Thank you, everyone at home. Appreciate everyone. Good to see everyone. Have a blessed week.